the external growth of a budding economy is over. The focus on growth now needs to be in the inner world. That's where the growth needs to happen.
This is Peak Moment. We are living at a peak of human innovation, information, wealth, and health. But we're also at a peak of population and consumption, with rising temperatures and declining resources fueled by cheap oil and gas. Peak Moment Television, bringing you examples of positive responses to energy decline and climate change through local community action.
Hi, welcome to Peak Moment. I'm Janaea Donaldson. In spring of 2010, I had a conversation by video link with Carolyn Baker about her recent book, Sacred Demise, Walking the Spiritual Path of Industrial Civilization's Collapse. I'm really pleased now to meet her in person. Thank you for joining me.
It's really a pleasure to be here, Janaea.
We've been waiting for a while.
Waiting for a long time, yes.
And also on the occasion of your latest book. I mean, you didn't wait too long on this one. We've got Navigating the Coming Chaos, a handbook for inner transition.
Yes.
Wonderful titles, both of them. But an unusual juxtaposition. I realize, you've got a background as an adjunct professor in history and years of being a psychotherapist, which is kind of an interesting blend. Tell us how you came to write these books.
Well, I've been tracking world events and trying to make sense of them since the year 2000. Wow. And around the year 2007, it became very clear to me that many, many people were preparing logistically for an uncertain future. And the transition movement has helped with that enormously. People were storing food, they were learning how to grow gardens, they were reskilling. But the thing that I noticed was not being addressed was emotional and spiritual preparation for this really uncertain future. And I realized, the more I thought about it, that the collapse of industrial civilization is in itself a spiritual practice, just walking through that. So I was inspired to write Sacred Demise. I thought maybe it might sell 30 copies and that's it, but it turns out it was hugely successful. And then I felt a couple years later like I really needed to take it deeper. And so I took it to the next level with Navigating the Coming Chaos, which I called the subtitle, A Handbook for Inner Transition. I see it as somewhat of a companion to the Transition Handbook in that respect.
The Transition Handbook by Rob Hopkins and the folks that started, which is really about how preparing you and your family and community to be prepared for a post-peak oil future, where we don't have cheap energy, where we don't have an economy that's built on growth, all of those conditions.
And I like to think of the Transition Handbook as a way to create sustainable communities. I like to think of my Navigating the Coming Chaos as a handbook for creating sustainable people.
Well, it's going to take people who are sort of, what I hear you saying is inwardly prepared, knowing that what we've had in our lives up till now is not necessarily going to, well, it isn't continuing. As it is.
And so how do we find meaning and purpose in all of those losses?
Well, you start in your book, and I also want to say you've just finished a workshop on this, so I want you to be sure to share gems from that experience of the workshop. But let's start. You start with creating an inner bunker, which I found a fascinating image. My first hit was, I've only known the word bunker relative to wartime. Or wartime, it's like... to sort of picture that you do spiritual work, but it's wartime. Well, that, of course, is maybe when it most is needed, when there's real stress.
Absolutely. It's interesting. The first section of my book is called Creating an Internal Bunker. Build your internal bunker. Spiritually and emotionally, by working, doing the inner work that needs to be done to prepare for the future.
And what do you mean? I mean, be specific. What is that? What kind of inner work? Because that could be kind of fuzzy for some folks.
Well, what I mean by that is looking at the emotions that are likely to come up in this collapse process. One of the resources that I draw on heavily is a book by the psychologist Miriam Greenspan. It's called Healing Through the Dark Emotions. And in that book, she talks about how we can work with our fear, with our despair, with our grief, and so on, and actually transform those. She uses the word alchemically transform them. And we can utilize those as we go through these really uncertain times to help us prepare emotionally, to strengthen ourselves, and also to reach out and be of assistance to other people who may not have that preparation.
Well, you know, in the book, actually, it strikes me as the largest section you have is very specific practices and things to pay attention to, mindfulness on those emotions and anger. It strikes me that our culture is not very good at preparing us for, well, it's not saying it's okay to be in despair. It's not okay to be, maybe some anger a little bit, but not to be afraid, all of those things.
Well, this is a culture of numbness. You know, we are not allowed, we're not given permission to have any emotions, even a fair amount of joy. If you have too much joy, you're too happy, what's wrong with you? And so, we just like to keep everything on an even keel, kind of a steady state of numbness in our culture. And when we have all these losses and when things begin to really unravel, we're going to have all kinds of feelings. We're going to be experiencing, for many people, trauma. And so we're going to have to cope with different emotions. And in a culture of numbness, we're not prepared for that.
So you're suggesting that people, by being in touch with that for themselves, naming it, feeling it, giving themselves permission, can be better prepared when it hits more strongly for themselves and the people around them, maybe help other people.
Because then they won't be blindsided by it. It may be larger than they're prepared for. Nobody can be fully prepared, but to be totally blindsided. And I worry very much about billions of people right now who think that everything's going to go back to normal and that business as usual is going to return. That's not going to happen.
Tell us more about that. In fact, you said in your, I want to mention that your daily email digest is a wonderful resource. Your ability to just sort of filter and organize sort of key articles and essays about that are indicators of collapse, symptoms of collapse happening right now, as well as the real options for people who are building the other, transitioning to a less, a more self-reliant and community building kind of reality. So you give us both.
Right.
And the other, sometime within the last week or two, I was startled to notice that you said you aren't going to use the word collapse in future tense anymore.
Right.
And of course that was right after the Japan reactor.
Right. Exactly.
And tsunami.
Well, Janaea, I don't have to tell you that they're telling us now in mainstream news, it's official, that the level of radiation that came from the Fukushima reactors was 1,250 times above the safe level. Yeah. MSNBC and many other news outlets were reporting that in terms of disaster, comparing this with 3 Mile Island, it's 100,000 times worse than that disaster. So people are beginning to really get it that collapse is happening, unraveling is happening right now. And the ripples of this aren't just that there's some radiation that's over in the Western Hemisphere. We're going to be seeing ongoing ripples economically as all of this affects the economy of the entire world and the United States.
Well, and that taken on the heels of the environmental disaster in the Gulf a year ago.
Yes.
And on the heels of the housing bubble collapse and the economic collapse of 2008. I mean, it's like, it's just bing, 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 bing. And it's like we're not in the same world we were 5 years ago.
I recently had the privilege of being in Sedona, Arizona with a group of people, and we met at one point with a Cherokee medicine woman. And she talked to us a little bit about the Mayan calendar, and she said that a couple of days later, after we were actually having this meeting, would be the beginning of the last phase of the Mayan calendar.
Oh, interesting.
And that would mean that every 20 days from now on would be the equivalent to 365 days. So if we feel like things are speeding up, we're not crazy, they are.
Well, and they have. The Japan tsunami happened right within the time, the first of those.
Yes, it did.
It was a year within
did.
that 20 days.
Yes, yes.
So the other, I want to just, back to your book here, dealing with challenging emotions. You also are talking here about allies. gaining allies. And so tell us about that idea and your
well,
workshop.
yeah,
too.
there's a second section in the book called Allies in the Great Turning, Who's Turning With You. And it's all about relationship. And I define relationship in a much broader context than just my partner, my children, my parents, my coworkers. I define it in terms of everything we have in our lives, everything we do, everybody we know is a relationship. We have relationships with our possessions, with our roles, with our activities, and so on.
Where we live.
And so we need to look at those relationships and see how they are fitting in with or not our preparation for an uncertain future. And so that's one of the things that I suggest in the book, and give some tools for how to deeply evaluate our relationships. Another thing in terms of relationships is that I also have a collapse coaching practice, or sometimes I call it a transition counseling practice, in which people call me from all over the country and the world to talk about how to prepare, or maybe they're in situations where they are awake and they've been preparing for a long time, but their partner, spouse, child don't want to hear about it.
Yes.
And so this is a very, very painful situation for both parties. And so I've been doing a lot of work with folks about that, and it's inspired me to create a workshop, an entire workshop called Relationships in the Long Emergency, which I'm very available to take to people's communities if they want me to come there and do that, to work with families, couples around this issue.
And in fact, the workshop you just came back from here in California, tell us about that as well, and how it fits in with
Yeah,
the book.
that was not, well,
it wasn't the same. It wasn't.
Well, I gave a Friday night talk on relationships in the long emergency, but the day-long workshop that I did was about navigating the coming chaos.
Okay.
It was based around my book. And one of the first things that we did in the workshop was to talk about death. And the reason we kind of put that at the top of the day is that, you know, most people in the workshop understand, and I have understood for a long time, that most people don't want to really talk about the collapse of industrial civilization, because when you strip off all the layers of how problematic that is, it comes down to a fear of death. So we did a workshop, we did an exercise in the workshop called Die Before You Die. And, you know, Rumi, the wonderful Persian poet, talks about die before you die. And so we did a process like that. And some people had done it before, but many people were very, very profoundly moved by this and said, you know, this in itself was worth the price of admission, just to be able to do this process. Because then from there we can go on and talk about all the subtleties of these losses and the collapse of industrial civilization. We don't have to have that huge fear hanging over us.
That's the big elephant in the room.
That's the big
right,
elephant,
in this culture.
Yeah.
I know the workshops that I have done that had me paying attention to my own dying, it have been, you're right, deeply moving. I mean, that's core what I find in your books. This is not a book about just superficial things. You are really doing soul work. You're doing work at the core of who we are.
Well, you know,
death is right there.
Yeah, and I tell people that these are not books of information that I write. You know, in this culture, we've become information junkies. We want to read a book and then get all this information and then cast it aside, get another book, get all this information. My books are a study. So they're toolkits for preparing emotionally and spiritually for the future. And, you know, I suggest that people slow down, and I've put at the end of each chapter very contemplative exercises, very practical exercises that people can do over a period of time. And you can finish the book, do all the exercises, and 5 years later come back to it, and it's a whole new ball game.
Yeah, they seem to be sort of evergreen in that way to me, you know, because I realize that because we move in our own personal evolution, our own development, those same questions looked at 5 years from now will evoke a different answer for who we are.
Yeah.
So you started in your workshop with death, facing that. Then where did you go?
Well, then we went to healing the dark emotions. We went to some of the specific emotions and talking about those and working with those, and we're just scratching the surface. We did a lot of dialoguing with each other, a lot of sharing, a lot of community building. And, you know, people who came to this workshop were very concerned, because they are on the West Coast, about the effects of radiation here in California.
Right.
And you know, I was thinking that maybe if I had come six months ago, there may not have been this intense interest. But this weekend, I found that people were extremely ready to drop into the deeper places because of these concerns.
And those folks who are willing to just even start that kind of practice, as your books are about, are going to be some of our, I can imagine, some of the pillars for their communities, for their families, and so on, and maybe hopefully spread that.
Yes. You know, I like to say that therapy of the future is not going to be practiced in some neat, tidy office, you know, for 50 minutes and, you know, covered by insurance. But therapy of the future might be two people sitting together in rubble, holding each other's hands and just listening to each other's pain and comforting each other and supporting each other and getting through that.
So what you're really doing is helping people open their hearts.
Yes.
Because you have a quote there from Joanna Macy's that when our hearts break open, you find the whole universe.
Yes.
You know? And that's also part of what our culture has tended not to have, is that permission to go into that kind of depth, because the depth includes the dark emotions, includes death, includes the stuff that's frightening to us.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Frightening.
But, you know, on the other hand, I want to say that when we move through these dark emotions, and really only when we move through these dark emotions, we can experience a level of joy that we never ever dreamed possible. This is how we get to our joy. And, you know, as well as preparing and learning all of these skills and so forth in anticipation of this unraveling, you know, people begin to notice when they put their minds and hearts to this that it's a joyful process. You know, and I've even had people say, you know, doing this with other people in my community is actually fun. So there's deep meaning and purpose and joy that people are experiencing through this.
I was going to say, there's meaning. It's like there is a purpose here. We are partly shepherding probably the most momentous transition humanity may have ever gone through.
Yes.
And we get to be here now, part of that. It certainly has brought meaning to your life, our lives.
Absolutely.
To do that. I think that's what many people do lack in a consumerist culture is, why am I here? You know, surely more than, you know, the person that buys the next latte.
Right.
And the thing that I treasure in your books is that you also encourage, along with joy, compassion, loving the natural world. I mean, being in touch with courage, beauty, creating beauty in our world. You know that.
Well, actually, I'm glad you mentioned that, because this is really important. The whole process of creating beauty. And so one of the things I do in all my workshops and my writings and whatever is that I really encourage people to create beauty. I use songs, stories told with the drum, poems, all of these ways of expressing and creating beauty, because we can only temper, you know, what might be really horrible situations with creating beauty and joy in the world. And the more we can do that, the more we can temper the situation.
It strikes me that feeds our souls, right?
Absolutely.
Being in beauty, being in, you know, music that just transports us, or creating art. I mean, for me, when I was so shook up by the radiation stories there, what I turned to was, I got my color pencils out and I worked with color, which is my way of stepping into the timeless.
Well, you know, what I say in all of my workshops, and you see this in writing my books, is that the collapse of industrial civilization is about remaking the soul. This is a deep and profound initiation for the human species, an opportunity to go through this ordeal and be remade by it, so that really we'll never be able to allow anything like industrial civilization to rear its head on this planet again.
Hear, hear.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah. I mean, we have a lot we've benefited from, and it's been a tremendous cost. Civilization.
Absolutely, yes.
Tremendous cost.
Absolutely.
For so many. You also had an idea that was rather fresh to me about elderhood.
Yes.
At any age. Tell us
sure.
your notion.
Well, you know, I was making the point in the workshop this weekend, and I do this in my writing, is that those of us who are aware that this is a collapse and we're preparing for it and we're opening our minds to it, we're sort of like elders who stand by in this process of initiation of our species to hold space for the rest of the culture. And even though we may be as scared as the next guy, at least we know what is going on. We're not going to be blindsided by it. And, you know, we can be present, perhaps, more readily with people who are completely panicked and freaked out than if we didn't have that knowledge.
I love that sense that elders whose job is to sort of keep the culture contained and provide wisdom here. It's not about age. It's about a level of maturity here.
Absolutely. We all know older people who are terribly immature and have never really matured in their lives. We all know younger people who are wise beyond their years and are very old souls, you might say, who really have that wisdom. Elderhood isn't about information or maturity or age. It's about wisdom. It's about wisdom.
So in about the last 5 minutes or so, I want to make sure other pieces from the workshop or your book that we haven't covered that you really want people to get.
I think the main thing that I want people to really hear is that we're out of time. What I'm saying is that we're out of time in terms of coming up to this collapse of industrial civilization. It's not in the future. It's happening now. We don't have the luxury of a lot of months and years to prepare. We need to be putting our attention to this as our main focus in life at this point, because there's no more time.
That's big. And we would not, the thing that I have sensed is, you know, our wake up and beginning to work with this was 5 years ago. It was in 05, 06. And it feels to me like the acceleration since that time is staggering to me.
It's huge, yeah.
And the unraveling of the economic system, which continues to unravel, and the standard of living for people already being reduced here in the United States and elsewhere. It feels like, well, as Richard Heinberg is saying, we're at the end of growth.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And it's like we haven't navigated some. Well, we don't have anybody in our own memory that have navigated this kind of collapse at the level that you're talking about.
And you know what? The external growth of a budding economy is over. The focus on growth now needs to be in the inner world. That's where the growth needs to happen.
That's beautiful. And there's a lot, and the riches there are infinite.
Absolutely.
The growth is infinite here. We don't have any limits. And maybe, unfortunately or not, the end of external economic growth may be that impetus to,
I believe so,
for us to really step up and mature.
Yes.
As a culture.
An evolutionary threshold, perhaps, for the human species.
The kind that would have us not do an industrial civilization kind of thing again. The way that I think the reminder that we are all interconnected and the planet is interconnected. Of course, global warming would be one of the reminders. The tsunami is one of those reminders that everything is interconnected, and we have sort of lost touch with that. We've had a lot of buffers between us and that with cheap energy.
No longer, because what happens in Japan, even if radiation didn't touch us, even if a tsunami didn't touch us, the economic ripples will be shaking our economy for a very long time. Everything is interconnected.
I want to add here is that one of my favorite aspects of your books, both of your books, is you have the most rich collection of poetry that I have come across from wonderful, you mentioned Rumi, Hafiz, Mary Oliver, William Stafford. I just want to say that even if one saw nothing else, I'm treasuring the poetry that you brought together that speaks deeply to me, and I expect to other people.
Well, thank you. And some people have told me that when they started reading Sacred Demise, you know, they had in their mind all of these things that they've read about the collapse of industrial civilization, the darkness, the losses, and oh boy, is this just another one of those books. But it was through the poetry, and it was through the inner work that they did, that they came away from that book and from navigating the coming chaos saying, you know, I'm really inspired. This collapse is my spiritual practice.
Wow. Wow, that's fabulous to hear. I imagine that the folks at your workshop weren't the same people leaving as they were when they came. Let's hope not.
Yeah.
The place that you know, as we wrap up here, in addition to thanking you for that, I want people to find out where can they find your daily email digest, which I find to be a very, you know, you're a very, what do I say, tempered, you filter of what news you bring through. First of all, you don't inundate us, and you kind of bring out the things that sort of seem most pertinent to think about, and it's not the world is falling apart tomorrow kind of information. So I want people to know where they can find that and your book and other resources.
They can find all of my resources at my website, carolynbaker.net. The Daily News Digest is published on a subscription basis. I very carefully collect and organize and bundle the news and send it to people's inboxes who are subscribers 7 days a week, except these days when I'm traveling.
Yes,
a couple of days I've missed, but
sure.
It's a labor of love that I do 7 days a week, 365 days a year. And it's really important. And the feedback that I've gotten is that this has really, really made a difference in people's lives.
I will sign up for that. That's it's my lens into the world, my starting lens into the world, and thank you for that. And thank you for your books, which I think are going to be a long, foundational and long-term resource for us.
Yes.
I look at them as the kind of book that I could open at any page and read something, and it's going to feed me. You know, that one can do this not just in a linear style, but in any book of wisdom. You open it up, and there's something to do or reflect on that's probably relevant for right now. Thank you for that richness.
You're welcome.
And I'm so glad we get to meet in person.
Me too.
Thank you.
It's been wonderful.
You're watching Peak Moment. I'm Janaea Donaldson. My guest is Carolyn Baker, author of Sacred Demise and Navigating the
Coming Chaos.
Coming Chaos.
Which isn't coming anymore. It's
here. Navigating the present chaos. A guide to inner transition.
Yes.
Join us next time.